Hi everyone, my name is Sohan and I would like to give you a brief demonstration of SpyREST. SpyREST is an automated RESTful API documentation tool that relies on example API calls to generate the documentation. When example API calls are made using SpyREST as a proxy server, the HTTP traffic is recorded and then synthesized so that the HTTP traffic can be converted into API documentation without needing any manual input after that. So let us get into some existing API documentations that have been generated using SpyREST. Here you see I have generated 5 different API documentations using SpyREST. Let's go to github.com, which is only serving version 3 at the time of doing this demonstration. And we have randomly picked 4 different resources from GitHub. Let's look at this endpoint called get notifications. So to generate everything you are seeing in this page is automatically generated based on 4 example API calls. So the generated documentation has 2 sections. The top section is what I call the summary section. Gives you 2 different tables, one for the query parameters where it shows you the query parameters used for the example calls, automatically parses the types, and also shows you the example values. There is a second table that shows you a structure of the response fields, again automatically inferring the data types. And then the second part of the documentation is the actual examples. I mentioned we use 4 API examples. In this case, the first one was listing notifications since a time. You see the actual endpoint was notifications with a since query parameter. For this example, we automatically show that this API action requires authorization. We can detect because there was an authorization header present during the call, which is automatically filtered so that no secrets are shared as a part of documentation. It shows you the request URL, query parameters, request headers, response headers, and a shortened response body. In this case, the response body is an array. For documentation purpose, we do not need to show the whole content of an array. Only sample values are sufficient to communicate the intent of the documentation. And there are other examples as you see here. This one shows you all the unread notifications. This one shows you only when the current user is directly participating. For each of these examples, the user can actually try them and execute them without having to write any code because we present them with a curl command. So they can simply copy, paste, and replace the filtered value of authorization with their own token and then see the API in action without writing any code. At the bottom of every page, there is a section to discuss questions related to this API documentation. And this helps both API developers and users of the APIs to have the information right in the same place as the API documentation. If you have noticed the hierarchy of the auto-generated documentation, you'll see that at the very top level, we have the API host, and then we have the version, and then we have a resource, and then an action for that resource. All of this is done based on 4 API calls that are made using SpyREST. For the second half of this demonstration, let us actually generate a new API documentation. Here you see that I have 5 different APIs already documented: GitHub, Kissmetrics, Liquid Planner, SpyREST, and Cakesite.com. In addition to these 5, let us generate our first documentation for OpenStreetMap. OpenStreetMap provides an API similar to Google Maps for map-related queries. The API that we are going to document is the one that shows you nodes that are put on maps that are bounded by a specific region. We will copy the API endpoint straight from the website, and I have prepared a partial curl request here. As you see, the first line is saying we are going to make a curl request and use SpyREST as a proxy. The second line is saying this specific request is describing an API that shows the nodes on maps bounded by a region. And then we will paste our copied URL. Sorry about that. Okay, looks like it worked this time. So once this API is called, SpyREST will give us the actual API response. But now if we go and refresh our API host page, we see that we now have a new API host, which is called openstreetmap.org. In this case, it's listed under default version. And then we see that the resource that we have is called nodes, and we already have a documentation generated for nodes.json. We also see that this nodes endpoint takes a query parameter called vbox, which is of type string and which has these example values. And then we also see the full structure of the response fields. And if you remember, we used a description to describe this example. This is exactly matching the description that we used. Users are still given a curl to try this API action without having to write any code. We have the request URL, query parameters, request headers, and all the fields. So all of this documentation has been generated solely based on that one line command to make an API call using SpyREST as a proxy. Now if you compare this documentation with the official documentation, you will see that the official documentation does not provide any information about the structure of the responses, but it provides additional description for fields to satisfy such needs, because we cannot extract this information from the example calls. SpyREST allows the users to add customized description using the Markdown editor. So now once the user is happy with custom edits, they can update it. And once updated, the update will sustain if we replay the API calls. If there was an updated version of this API tomorrow, an API developer only needs to rerun the example, and SpyREST will automatically update the documentation to reflect the latest changes. That was all about the demonstration of SpyREST. If you go to the home page at spyrest.com, it will show you a command where you can try SpyREST yourself and see how it helps automatically generating RESTful API documentation that is correct, customizable, consistent look and feel, and version aware, and provides collaboration features. Thank you for your time. I hope you take that extra step and try SpyREST in your next RESTful API documentation project.